Hey, Tom, welcome.
Nice to be here.
Hey, Tom, what's the elevator pitch you give when people meet you? Who are you? What do you do?
So I'm Tom Greenwood, and I'm the managing director of a specialist WordPress agency in London called Whole Grain Digital. And we work with what we call purpose-led organizations. And so that's sort of businesses with some sort of purpose beyond pure profit, whether that's environmental or social. And also we do a lot of work with nonprofits and the public sector. But our key focus is an obsession with sustainability, both on a business level within our own operations, but also in terms of our digital products and services that we build, and looking at how we can create sort of digital or make the digital world more sustainable.
Yeah, that focus on sustainability seems to be baked into your company at the very core. If you go to your website, it's in the graphics, it's in the clients such as Oxfam. It seems to be, as much as any company I've seen in a long time, it seems to be a focus that's essential to what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we started Whole Grain, it was actually, part of the reason we did it came from a sort of a question of is there really such a thing as a sustainable business? And well, let's start one to find out whether we can do it in practice.
This was a while ago, right? 13, 14 years ago now?
Yeah. So over 13 years ago. And and we've come a long way. I mean, and what I've learned in that time is that actually sustainability is very easy to talk about. But the more you get into it, the more you realize how far you are from true sustainability from a nature perspective. And so it's a bit of a rabbit hole that the more time goes on, the more you realize that you're not doing enough.
It becomes all consuming after a while.
Yeah, exactly.
So if someone is in a situation more like myself, who has just started to take an interest in this topic in the last couple of years, what are a couple of key takeaways that you can give people, even if they don't watch any more of this video? I'm going to be cheeky and suggest one, which is signing up for your newsletter, Curiously Green. That's how I found you, and a really excellent newsletter focused on sustainability and web design. So I'll give you that one. Sign up for Tom's newsletter. But is there anything else that you can suggest that if people are perhaps nervous or feeling overwhelmed, what are just a couple of key takeaways that people can focus on?
Sure. So, I mean, one I'd say is we've got a carbon calculator for websites, which is online at websitecarbon.com. So you can go there and just kind of play with it and test not just your own website, test other websites, so you can kind of see how they do and what's the difference between them. So I'd say have a play around with that. And the sign up form for the newsletter is in the footer of that website. And another one, if you just want to actually take a practical action, might be switch to a green hosting provider, something like that, which is a nice step where you don't have to actually change design or code or anything like that.
So take me through websitecarbon.com. I think it's a product of your company, right? It's a tool that your company has built.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we built it originally a few years ago. It came sort of really around the time when we certified as a B Corp 3.5 years ago. And
hold on a second. A B Corp?
A B Corp, yes. So a B Corp is a certification for businesses that it's sort of independent certification of high social and environmental standards. And it came from America, but it's now sort of a global standard that's becoming more and more common. And we went through that process 3.5 years ago as a way of kind of holding ourselves to account and finding out how well are we actually doing on this whole kind of sustainability journey. And have somebody said recently, stop marking your own homework. And I think that's kind of what it was for us, is have somebody else look at it and tell us how well we're doing. So we did that.
So a B Corp is not necessarily just a technical way to set up your company like an LLC or a particular kind of corporation, but it's also an external exam for your business?
It's exactly that, yes. So in America, it's a bit confusing because in America you have a thing called a benefit corporation,
yes,
which is a legal structure like a limited company or a community interest company or something like that. We don't have that in the UK. We don't have the benefit corporation legal status, but B Corp itself is a non-profit that basically runs a certification scheme. So you go through quite a rigorous certification process where you have to provide documentation and information about all these different aspects of your business, and then they rate you on that, and you have to get a minimum kind of pass mark in order to get the certification.
So a US company can actually file taxes as a B Corp, but that's not possible in the UK.
Correct. Yeah. So I know in the US you can be a benefit corporation, and that's got a different kind of legal status and tax implications and so on. In the UK, we're standard limited company from a legal point of view. It makes no difference over here in that sense, but the certification is something which is really there to help you validate how well you're doing and help you do better on social and environmental practices.
So the B Corp gave you an evaluation, maybe the first really detailed external evaluation of how your company is doing. And did this lead you to finding some flaws in what you were doing? Did it kickstart the process that ended up in building Website Carbon?
Yeah, so that's exactly it. So it asks a lot of questions,
okay,
and a lot of them are multiple choice. And it's interesting because you look at them and you're like, oh, I know what the right answer is, but I can't necessarily say that is what we do. I mean, and a lot of that stuff's around kind of policy and process and so on, which especially as a small business, a lot of things are done in a more kind of freestyle way, shall we say.
So the aim is not to get the highest possible score. The aim is to be as honest with yourself about your company as possible.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah. It's definitely, you've got to be in the spirit of doing it rather than doing it for the points and for the certification. You've got to be in the spirit of doing it so you can learn and then use that learning to actually improve. And what we found from going through the process was actually it raised a lot of questions that maybe weren't even directly related to the assessment itself, and there were no points associated with them. But things like thinking about the impact of your, the environmental impact of your products and services, and actually looking at the questions, it occurred to us, well, digital products are not really actually covered in this assessment because the impacts they're asking for are like manufacturing related.
Are you polluting the nearby stream? Are you producing tons of plastic goods?
Exactly. Where's your waste going? Are there toxic materials and, water usage, these sorts of things. And it occurred to us that on the one hand, like we actually can't get points in the assessment for this stuff because it's not directly relevant. But on the other hand, it made us think, but actually, is there an impact to digital stuff? Because previously we'd sort of assumed that there either wasn't, or if there was, it was kind of negligible, so you didn't really need to think about it. But that whole conversation led us down this rabbit hole of asking the question and thinking, well, it's not enough to assume. We need to actually start doing some research and finding out. So that's when we started sort of digging into like academic research that had already been done on the sort of the topic of energy consumption and the internet, and that then led us to realize that actually this is a big problem. The sort of the headline statistic is like 2% of global carbon emissions come from the internet, and that's a chunky percentage. I mean, two sounds like a small number as a percentage, but actually, like if you think about it, it's a lot. I mean, global shipping I think is about 2%. Global aviation is about 2%. So we're a fairly sort of heavy hitting industry when you put it in that context.
Yeah, this is a problem that's maybe moving onto our plate fairly quickly as software developers. A few years ago, maybe this wasn't such an issue, but as software is eating the world, as more and more businesses, more and more tasks that everyone is doing are moving online. So this is increasingly becoming a problem that we're going to have to tackle.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things where we are using digital more and more and more. So the impact of it is growing, even though computers and networks get more efficient over time. Our increasing hunger for data is accelerating faster than the improvement in efficiency.
So what does Website Carbon do? What kind of things is it evaluating? If I head over there now and run one or two of our sites through the system, what kind of things is it looking for? What kind of feedback is it going to give me?
Sure. So what it's doing is it's using as the primary metric. It's using data transfer over the wire. And what we found was, there's lots of debates over what's the best way of measuring this. But when it comes down to it, the only kind of the way that most of the academic studies have done it is you're looking at data transfer and then equating a sort of an energy impact per gigabyte or per megabyte.
Is it literally the size of the site that's the problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's multiple problems. The question is which ones you can directly measure. So the size of the site is a big part of it. And the more data, the bigger the files, basically, the more data's got to be transferred, the more data's got to be stored. And that translates into, an increased energy consumption. So that's the primary metric that we look at, because that seems to be the thing that is measurable and can be used as a kind of a representative of the efficiency of your site. It's important to note that there are things that we can't measure and we can't factor in. So we can't directly see inside your server and find out what type of machines you're running or how efficient your queries are on the server and things like that. But yeah, the size of the files is a great kind of representation of at least kind of front end efficiency.
So it doesn't necessarily help if I'm running a CDN or if I'm zipping everything up or actually optimizing the delivery. That if I just have a really big site with a ton of large images, then that's going to be a problem no matter how fast it loads.
Yeah, that's it. And so there are efficiency gains to be made by things like CDNs, especially because data transfer is basically part of the problem. There is the distance you've got to transfer it. And the further it has to go, the more hops it has to make, the more electricity it's using. So actually in that context, we've got websitecarbon.com is like a public test, and it has to be able to do things that can be kind of done on the fly with just a URL that you input. So we have to make assumptions about things like, whether you're using a CDN and so on. And it's sort of standardized in those assumptions. What we've got kind of in-house is a big spreadsheet that we can tinker about with to try to sort of factor in other things like, is there a CDN, or where is the data center, or where are the end users in terms of their the carbon intensity of their local electricity and things like that. So there are lots of variables that you can start tweaking with if you're really, really nerdy about
it. So this is an internal spreadsheet you have for your own customers' projects that you use to kind of evaluate how sustainable the different projects that you're building? Yeah,
that's it. I mean, I'd say it's in terms of getting really nerdy about it, it's mainly an internal interest, an internal interest thing. It's something that clients at this point, I'd say, are sort of. I don't think most clients are yet at the point where they see digital sustainability as something they want to sort of invest in, doing really detailed analysis on.
You just want to know you're doing good work.
Exactly. Yeah. So it helps us learn and improve.
So both of us are pretty heavily involved in the WordPress world, and much of the work that you do is in WordPress. So if I'm a WordPress developer, I come along to websitecarbon.com and my site ends up ranking in the bottom 10% of all the sites that are measured. I really have a big, slow site. What can I do to make it better? What are the WordPress specific steps that someone like myself should start with to produce a lighter, faster, more sustainable site?
Sure. So, I mean, I would always say that if you design inefficiency from the beginning, when you're doing a new site, you're going to get like the best outcomes. But in practice, we're not all starting from a blank sheet of paper. Most websites already exist, and we don't have the time and the money to necessarily redesign them from the ground up.
I have heard of some people that take the starting point very literally. I've heard of this in the performance space, where people will give themselves a budget of a certain number of kilobytes, or a certain loading time, loading time average, and then they'll reverse engineer what they're doing. This one that someone was telling me about came from the client, I think. The client said, we need to make sure that our site is under a certain number of kilobytes and loads under 1 second in average. And then from that starting point, they had to reverse engineer all the features to make sure they met the target. And they had to end up abandoning quite a few different things in order to meet that goal.
Yeah, exactly. And,
so you have the same advice, basically. In an ideal world, you would start by thinking about this right at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. And you do exactly that. So for example, we have the same concept in-house about a page weight budget. So you can actually start and say, well, we know that in order for it to load in a certain time, for it to have a carbon impact under whatever the target we set, means that a page can't be more than like 500 kilobytes, something like that. And then you could start making design decisions based on that. So, when you want full screen images, well, okay, but how big is a full screen image? Even if you compress it, it's going to be, a couple of hundred kilobytes, something like that. So maybe we don't need a full screen image. Maybe we can create a different style. Maybe we can use sort of CSS graphics or something instead of a photograph. And you start having these conversations that sort of in the creative process about how can we create the style and the user experience that is going to serve the purpose without necessarily blowing the page weight budget. So that's absolutely what I recommend in an ideal world.
How does that apply to WordPress? What are the specific pain points, the specific blockers you come across with WordPress?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few things with WordPress specifically. So one of them is just sort of sizing of images, and I think that's like a really common issue. I mean, it's a common issue with websites in general. But I think so sizing and compressing images and doing it on the fly, so that the nature of WordPress is that people are going to be editing the content all the time. So it shouldn't be something that the web developer has to do as like a one-off thing. It needs to be something that happens automatically. So having a good image compression system inside your WordPress site is great. And I mean, we use ShortPixel, and ShortPixel has a new kind of level of it. It's called ShortPixel AI, but the AI, I can't remember what the AI stands for. It doesn't stand for artificial intelligence.
Oh, that's confusing.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's something like automated imagery or something.
That acronym should be basically taken. Okay.
Yeah.
AI is this. You need to figure out a new acronym for yourselves.
Yeah, exactly. It is confusing. It sounds a bit more high tech than it really is. But yeah, so the ShortPixel AI solution is then, it's looking at making sure that the images are sized correctly for the use case. So as a thumbnail image, it's loading a thumbnail image. It's compressing the images to the sort of relevant quality. It's also looking at converting those images to the appropriate format. So if you upload a JPEG, but if the user's browser supports WebP, it will serve a WebP.
Okay, so image optimization is a big one. People often have images which are way too big, way too heavy.
Yeah.
What else in the WordPress context can people focus on?
So in the WordPress context, and this obviously doesn't impact the design process, but caching is a big one. So one of the questions that we often get is that if we're an agency that is so obsessed with sustainability, why are we a WordPress agency?
Okay.
Because those two things, to people in the know, those two things sound at odds. WordPress, like by its very nature, as a sort of dynamic PHP-based CMS, like every time somebody hits a page, it's like doing a load of work on the server basically building the page.
Oh, okay. So
every time.
So WordPress has some fundamental problems with sustainability. It's by its very nature, it's too dynamic. It's too much of a load on the server, and one of the ways you can solve that is with a very heavy approach to caching.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, we always recommend server caching, so that you can kind of try to basically just keep what you're really trying to do with server caching is try to keep people away from WordPress. It's like a shield in front of WordPress to stop people actually having to query it at all. But I mean, obviously, if you don't have a host that can do that, then there are plugins that can do a pretty good job, even if not quite as good as server-side caching. So, like WP Rocket is a really good one.
Okay, so when it comes to the image optimization, Short Pixel is a good choice. When it comes to the caching tools, WP Rocket is a good plugin. Do you use any other tools to optimize your caching?
Not really off-the-shelf ones, to be honest, because we pretty much always use WordPress-specific hosting, so WP Engine or Kinster, and they have the caching built in. So we really only have to look at kind of manually setting up some sort of caching inside WordPress. If there's some reason why the client already has a server that they don't want to move from, and it doesn't have any sort of caching system available on it.
This is kind of locked into your choice of host to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely. And the hosting also, our choice of hosting, so that's part of it. There's an efficiency level gain in terms of having a host that has really good caching as part of its platform. But then also we look at having hosts that have a commitment to using renewable energy in the data centers. So that was quite a challenge until quite recently, but a lot of hosts basically piggyback off the kind of the big cloud companies. So Amazon and Google. And Google's got, undoubtedly out of those, the best sustainability kind of promise. So they say they've been using 100% renewable energy since 2 years ago. You can get into the weeds of like what that really means. But WP Engine, for most of their accounts, use Google Cloud Platform, but not on their enterprise accounts, as far as I'm aware. They use AWS on that. But Kinster is 100% Google Cloud Platform.
So most of these WordPress hosting companies end up being somewhat similar because they rely so heavily on Google or Amazon or one of the other big cloud providers, that most of these managed WordPress hosting companies are built on top of someone else's platform. And so the sustainability level really depends on that underlying choice, whether they're with Google, Amazon, Microsoft, or someone else. Yeah,
exactly. And some of them use a mixture. So like Flywheel, for example, we've had various conversations with them over the last few years, and what's come out, they were very open with us that, they use a mixture of data center providers, and they don't have any of their own data centers. So they're kind of at the mercy of those providers that they chose in the past before they even thought about this. And then there's others who just won't tell you. Because they don't really want you to know who's the underlying provider.
So in that case, you just strike them off the list if at all possible, if they're not willing to share that information.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So when it comes to image optimization, Short Pixel would be a good choice. When it comes to caching, WP Rocket, if you're not relying on your hosting. If you had to choose one or two hosting companies, which would be an ideal choice for sustainability, do you have a couple of recommendations? Would it be Kinster and WP Engine?
Yeah, so I think just as a sort of general from a WordPress perspective, they're definitely really good choices, and most of our clients host with them. Because it's not just, you don't just get the sustainability angle, you get all the other benefits that go with that in terms of performance and security and so on. And customer support that's WordPress specific. Another really good choice if you're looking at something a bit more bespoke is Positive Internet, which is a UK-based hosting company. who have their own data center. So they're not piggybacking off one of the big tech companies, but they have their own data center in Cambridgeshire, which is powered by a renewable energy supply. And they're like, they really get it, and they really care about this stuff. They're very geeky about it. And that, their name suggests positive internet. They're trying to do things in a good way.
They're almost like the hosting version of you, that their approach to this is fundamentally built into to their approach, to how they do this, to how they think about hosting. That it's not an afterthought, as it may be with some hosting companies, that positive internet, and to be honest, I've never heard of them, but positive internet take a similar approach to whole grain, that they are green first and foremost as a core part of what they do.
Yeah, exactly. And, and similarly wrapped up in that, like they really care about things like security and, data privacy and, these other kind of bigger issues that are part of our industry.
Cool. So we've got image optimization, caching, and green hosting for WordPress users.
Yeah.
Are there any other things that WordPress developers can think about and focus on?
Yeah. So, I guess one of the things is just thinking carefully about plugins. So, it's a minefield, because some plugins probably don't really have much of an impact, and some of them even have a positive impact, such as a caching plugin or an image optimization plugin. But there's a lot of plugins that are just, they're bloat, so they're sort of unnecessary extra code, doing extra work, not necessarily useful. But then some of that is also outputting onto the front end. So you've got plugins that push extra scripts onto the front end of the site that probably don't really need to be there. It's just that that's the way that the plugin developers decided to do it. And you can often end up with doubling up of scripts, because one plugin doesn't know that script's already on your site. So they all include whatever they need. And so that can end up not just having a kind of an impact on efficiency from a sustainability point of view, but also can end up slowing your site down.
And maybe themes as well. You have your own bespoke WordPress theme called Granola?
Yeah, so themes is definitely a big thing. So if you're using an off-the-shelf theme, that's again like these kind of all-in-one themes that you get from sort of Theme Forest and so on, tend to be like, let's throw everything in, even if you don't need it, and that can have an impact, not just kind of in excess sort of bloat on the server side, but also on the browser side.
This theme is awesome. It could be a learning management system. It could be a shopping cart. It could be a yoga studio. It could be it could be a brewery.
Exactly.
It could be anything you want.
It's a Swiss Army knife. But yeah. Exactly. So we've got our own starter framework, really, called Granola. Theme is we've realized theme is a dangerous word to use in context, in the sense that with WordPress, a theme implies it's something that's really plug and play. You download it, you upload it to WordPress, you hit activate, and you've got a website. And Granola is not that. Granola is really kind of a starting point for developing a custom theme. And really at the heart of Granola is stripping out a lot of stuff that isn't necessary, but also setting like best practice in terms of development standards. But at the heart of it is a set of build tools that basically are there to optimize the code and the site and make sure it's as efficient as it can be in terms of stripping out kind of excess code and optimizing assets and so on. Awesome.
So as WordPress users, there are some things we can do. And if we do all of these, we've got a chance to produce a pretty fast, pretty green website. We just need to think about it as we go through the process. That if we plan for sites with maybe a lighter load of images, optimized images, if we plan to choose green hosting, if we plan to have a good caching setup, if we plan to pick and choose carefully when it comes to our plugins and themes, then we may end up with a really good score on Website Carbon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so at the beginning, I asked you two things that people can do, and we said, okay, go and sign up for the Curiously Green newsletter, which has a really good sort of every 2-3 weeks, a really good kind of
it's once a month
monthly summary of environmental news in the tech space. And we also said people should head over to website carbon.com and analyze their site and figure out what they can do better.
Yeah, that's right. And if I could throw one more in, just as a kind of more of a philosophical one, we co-wrote the Sustainable Web Manifesto with a bunch of other people in the industry a couple of years back. And so you can go over to, if you just Google Sustainable Web Manifesto, you'll find it. And you can read that and sign it and sort of put your name down as sort of pledge that you're going to embed these principles into your work.
Okay. So in a brief summary, what's the manifesto about? What's in it? What will people see when they visit it?
Sure. So what they're going to see is basically 6 principles to consider and try to sort of embed into any digital project in order to ensure that those digital projects are aligned with a sustainable world. So it should be clean. So the electricity should come from clean, renewable sources, should be efficient. So that's really kind of a lot of the stuff we've been talking about here in terms of eliminating waste, in whether that's waste in terms of doing like queries on the server or waste in terms of loading files that are bigger than they need to be or don't even need to be there at all. So clean and efficient. Then the next 2 principles are open and honest, because actually a lot of kind of sustainability issues come from concealing problems or greenwashing and so on. So there's and then the last 2 are regenerative and resilient. Regenerative from the point of view that, we're already at a point now in history where being neutral, this idea of whether it's carbon neutral or whether it's just kind of planet neutral, the idea of being neutral is no longer really relevant. It's like we've done so much damage that now we have to be actively repairing it. So how can we think about that in our work and see if we can actually build things that help people, make the planet heal itself. Big challenge. Hence, I said it's more of a philosophical one. And then resilient. And I think this resilient is really an interesting one from a web point of view, because actually a lot of web services are really critical, and more so as our lives go more and more online. Our lives are really, these services, whether it's kind of information about emergency services, you mentioned that you're in Florida and you have hurricanes, and so one of the things there is like, how do you get information about like the weather and the news when like the internet is getting patchy because the hurricane is impacting the networks? Those sorts of things to think about in the future, where resilience of web services helps people, but it also helps people in the context of a climate that is going to be less and less friendly to the telecoms networks, effectively.
Perhaps it's mostly thinking about the big picture. I mentioned earlier that these are new problems falling on our lap to some extent, because 10 years ago, maybe a lot of these systems did not run over the internet. A lot of these systems were done manually. Maybe it was a phone call to alert people for emergencies. But now, increasingly, as software developers, as WordPress developers, a lot of these problems that didn't concern us a few years ago are now increasingly being built on our platforms, using our technology. And these are problems that are increasingly becoming our responsibility to think about.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's spot on. A lot of this stuff wasn't stuff that we really needed to think about a few years ago, or at least we didn't realize that we needed to think about it. But now
10 years ago, WordPress was a minuscule percentage of the web. Now, as everyone keeps on mentioning, it's running close to 40% of the web. an increased responsibility on our shoulders.
Absolutely, it really is, and you've sort of hit the nail on the head there. Where I mentioned earlier that people ask us sometimes, like, if you care about sustainability, why do you use WordPress? And actually, what you just said about WordPress being 40% of the web sums it up. Like, part of the reason we chose WordPress 13 years ago, because it was a great system and still is, in terms of serving our clients' needs and giving them, empowering them to take control of their own content. But equally, now we're at this point, years down the line, where we're looking at sustainability harder and questioning, like, is WordPress the right solution? And actually, we feel that we can make more impact by trying to make WordPress, which is 40% of the internet, super efficient than we could by saying, well, we're going to give that up and we're going to give a small number of people super efficient websites using some other technology, but kind of leave behind all those people who are using WordPress.
I think that's a really good way to sum it up, Tom. Thank you so much for your advocacy over the last few years in this area. I know you're making an impact. You're probably the number one reason through your newsletter why I was prompted to get curious about this topic. And I hope this video and the work you keep on doing prompts more people to take an interest as well.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's really, really nice to hear. And I'm very much looking forward to listening to the rest of this podcast series.